Okay, welcome to Screencast on Alexander and a war crime he commits, also the rocky fortress of Sogdiana and marrying Roxanne, and then a little bit on the policy of fusion, which is what we covered today, Friday, the 11th of the 9th. So Alexander's men came across this town of the Brankaide in Afghanistan, a Greek town in the middle of Afghanistan. Not unusual. The Greeks were great travelers and great settlers, and Greek towns were set up all over the Middle East. But they came across this town in Afghanistan, and it has an interesting history because the ancestors of the Brankaide, they were the people who lived at Didyma, and they collaborated with the Persians in the previous Persian wars. And because of their treason, the Persians decided, let's resettle the people of Didyma at a town deep in the Persian Empire where they would be safe from any revenge taken by the Greeks, and that was the Brankaide, and they were settled at this town that Alexander came across. So when Alexander and his men came across this town, the people of the townspeople were the descendants of the Brankaide who had collaborated with the Persians over 100 years ago previously at the town of Didyma. You remember the Oracle of Didyma was where Alexander turned up in the sacred spring, which had been dry, did spring forth anew because of Alexander rocking on up. So Alexander sought revenge, which is interesting because he hasn't been personally slighted, but he decided to take revenge on the townspeople because of what their ancestors had done. When the people came out and welcomed Alexander's men and gave them shelter, and the following day they paraded through the town with olive branches, a traditional sign of peace and friendship, and gifts for the Macedonians. But Alexander had stationed his men around the town. At his signal, they attacked the town, and they slaughtered the men, the women, the children, the babies, despite the Brankaide pleading for their lives in Greek, because they were pleading to their fellow Greeks for their lives. Alexander's men did not stop, and they killed everyone and razed the town, as Alexander's tend to do, and also destroyed the olive groves around the town. Absolutely ruined the town, and there was no chance of being reestablished. Now, Curtius Rufus calls this sheer brutality against people who had never even seen Didyma. So it's an atrocious war crime by Alexander, and one that Arrian glosses over, doesn't even mention, but when it does come through in the sources, and it's highly likely that this happened, this certainly calls into question, I believe, Alexander's name, Alexander the Great. Nonetheless, after having demolished the town of the Brankaide, Alexander moved into the northeast, and this was where it really became difficult for Alexander. Bactria and Sogdiana up here, they were not interested in Greek rule at all, and these were the finest horsemen in all of Asia, and they did lightning attacks on Alexander's men. Alexander's men were completely unprepared for this sort of guerrilla warfare of these horsemen sweeping down from the high mountains and attacking the Macedonian columns and then disappearing off over the horizon and attacking again. Made it very, very difficult for the Macedonians, and more so because Alexander was wounded and he was ill and he couldn't actually be there to fight. He had to stay in his tent. It was an absolutely brutal war, the Northeast campaign, ultimately successful in the end, but thousands of Macedonians were killed, and including one infamous example where Alexander wasn't able to lead his men and they were massacred by these tribesmen sweeping down from the mountains. So this was a brutal, brutal part of Alexander's campaign, and much has been written about it. The difficulties of fighting in Afghanistan, which is lessons that have been learned over history, that you just don't conquer Afghanistan. In more recent history, the Russians learned that in the 1980s, and the USA learned that in the early 2000s. You cannot conquer Afghanistan. It's quite straightforward. Alexander did manage to keep control of the area because he dominated the rocky fortress of Sogdiana. Now, Oxyates was the ruler of Sogdiana, and as Alexander's men approached, he retreated into their rocky fortress, and they were very confident they could resist Alexander because, as you can see, the nature of the defences of this fortress, that they had no issues with Alexander, thought they could easily settle there, and Alexander would be worn down by the lightning attacks from the men coming down from the hills. Alexander, according to Arrian, gave them a chance to surrender, asked them to surrender, and they refused. And Oxyates actually said, you'll need to find soldiers with wings to take my rocky fortress. And so what Alexander did, he called in volunteers, and 300 of his men volunteered to try to climb this precipice during the night. And the men used tent pegs to hammer into the rock face and claw themselves up. About 30 of them fell to their deaths during the night as they were trying to climb, particularly as you can see up the summit. It was extraordinarily difficult to go up here. And as Arrian notes, these 30 men did not utter a sound as they fell to their deaths, lest they give away what the Macedonians were doing, because the Oxyates' men were so confident he hadn't posted guards at all. And as dawn broke, Alexander's men, the 270 of them, did reach up to the rocky fortress, and they climbed on top of the largest wall. And they stood there as dawn came up and silhouetted them in the shadow there. And the message to Oxyartes was, "Look up and see my winged soldiers." Oxyartes was so impressed, I guess, by what Alexander had did that he surrendered immediately. And Oxyartes held a celebratory party. Now him and Alexander were allies, and at the party his daughter Roxanne danced for Alexander. Alexander fell in lust with her, and they married. This is one of the most mysterious decisions Alexander made, was to marry a Persian child bride, not having married a Macedonian woman, having Macedonian heirs. So he would have been about 29, she was 14 at the most. She was very, very young. It's his first marriage to a barbarian child bride. It's outrageous. It's insulting to his Macedonian men. It's insulting to Macedonia. It's insulting to everyone. Alexander doesn't care. He's going to marry this bride, and to hell with it. This does end the war in northern Asia, and Alexander is able to return to Balkh and prepare for the invasion of India. But look, it's a clear message. It's a clear message that Alexander is not going home. He is marrying a Persian, and he is going to stay in Persia, which leads us to Alexander's policy of fusion, which I suggest will be the template for what you will write about in the exam, fusing the two cultures together. Look, Alexander has completely made his hand really plain here. He is not going home. And you saw in the movie, Alexander said, "We are a toast to our children of the relationships between Macedonian men and Persian women. They will be our rulers in our new empire in Asia." And that is what Alexander is doing. So we can see where the policy of fusion, he links up with a few signs here. Using the satraps, reappointing Persians to rule different areas of Persia. Encourages men to take Persian wives, paying for them, paying for the wedding, paying for the dowry, because the children will be the future rulers of the empire in Asia. He starts to wear Persian clothes, the Persian luxury, which is completely opposite of what a Macedonian does. As I talked about, if you walked into the throne room and it was full of the king of Macedonia and his leading generals, you wouldn't have a clue. And if you didn't know what the king looked like, you wouldn't know who he was, okay, because they all look roughly the same. Pretty much dressed for war. And Alexander, however, starts to wear Persian clothes and starts to live like a Persian king. For example, taking Bagoas, the eunuch, as one of his lovers, is a very Persian thing to do. And he's thinking about the future of the Persian Empire rather than the glory of Macedonia. And this all really begins with Roxanne marrying this Persian child bride as an outrageous insult to his men and to Macedonia. And it does signify that Alexander has moved a long way from his Macedonian roots. And this is still here from the movie. Here's Alexander in his Persian finery, surrounded by Persians in the Persian clothes, his hair nicely done. He's not surrounded by his Macedonians, and he's not wearing his Macedonian clothes anymore. He has become extremely Persian. So that is the subject of today, and that's our screencast. Ka kite.